We now turn our attention to the social contract tradition in the study of ethics. We'll be looking at the social contract, self-interest, and a number of other factors that make up this important topic for discussion. We'll begin first by just overviewing our objectives for this unit. We're going to talk about some background issues and the definition of terms, and note something about the changes that are going on with justifying political and social justice and political and just forms of government. In relation to contractarianism itself, we'll be looking at the issues you see listed on the screen. We'll go through those and summarise them at the end. We'll note some benefits and attractions. You'll find some of these set out in detail in the textbook as well. And we'll also note the concerns and limitations. And we'll end up with the slide, what you need to know for the purposes of this course. Background. As we come to the period of Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and ultimately John Rawls, these major players in the development of the contract theory, there's great battles going on between about 1541 and 1799. I've listed some of them on the screen for you. Excuse me. The Elizabethan era is part of this era, and the struggles over Henry VIII. And that leads up, after the death of Elizabeth, to the English Civil War, the Spanish Armada, and the conflict between Spain, Britain, Spain and France and Spain. The tragic Civil War, the English Civil War, which was going to profoundly impact both Hobbes and Locke and their thinking. We will also note that there is a connection to the American tradition here, with the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolutionary War, connected also with the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon. It's an era in which there was war and conflict of war, and yet at the same time there was an enormous number of social, economic and political changes taking place. If you think of eras, you have the Renaissance, you come to the Reformation, you come to the Enlightenment period where rationalism is supreme, and you have Immanuel Kant leading the charge to begin with. You have the rise of British empiricism, of which Locke was a part, and to a sense in which Hobbes was a part as well, where you had to see it to believe it, touch it and feel it. And then the rise of modern science and the natural sciences and the secularization of culture. In other words, instead of having reason being dominant or having knowledge by experience dominant, you have a new kind of knowledge coming with science and a new approach to society coming. And as a result, there are a number of movements taking place with democracy and representative forms of government. You have the rise of cities, the industrialization of the West, new universities, wealth and property, and at the same time, enormous amount of poverty. And then there's a whole opening up of the new world, the American context, and other colonies becoming available and readily accessible to Europe. It was a huge time of change. And it's good to pause for a moment and just think about the idea of the contract theory. What is it all about? Well, contractarianism is the view that actions are morally right just because they are permitted by rules that free, equal and rational people would agree to live by, on condition that others obey the rules as well. I've taken this from Schaeffer-Liddell so that the textbook here and what I'm talking about are the same for the purposes of this course. And that's just a couple of observations as we look at this. We can see first and foremost that this is an artificial construct. It's an artificial construct because you'll note the phrase free, equal and rational people would agree to live by. There's an understanding that people have agreed to live by this, on the understanding that others will obey the rules. Now, what that means then is that these rules are justified by virtue of the agreement, this rational, that is, in a sense, an artificial creation. Rules are made in relation to what people would agree with. In other words, you make the rule and you say, would free, rational and equal people agree with these rules? And the answer, if yes, means it's a rule. What's important about that rule is that it's a shift from traditional way of viewing moral rules. Traditionally, moral rules were negative. We might think of the thou shalt nots. It prohibited wrong conduct. In other words, a person was viewed to be free so long as they didn't do this, this or this. You couldn't do that, but you could. You're free to do anything else you chose. And these free, equal and rational people make this agreement about the rules because they believe that all other free, rational and reasonable people, equal people, would agree with them. And they are, in a sense, a construct, just like the contract itself is a construct. And of course it raises the question, who are these people? What's their self-interest in doing that? And of course, that condition, on condition that others obey these rules as well, here again you have the concept that self-interest would cause one to do that. Now there's a pause here, and one of the things that is seen about this definition is it's alleged that it doesn't make any, it doesn't come to this structure, this structure, that it's this procedure which it sets up for making ethical decision, doesn't come with any preconceived terms, other than these are free, equal and rational people intuiting what others would agree to, on the understanding that they've intuited that other people will agree to live by them. This is called proceduralism, and theoretically it makes this whole procedure of making rules objective and coming into existence without assumptions. I'm going to question that a little later on. What we're seeing in this definition, and as we'll see in the discussions about the development of the social theory, is that there's a movement, a shift from justifying the rational basis of the good life, define what a good life is, and justifying moral and political, economic structures to support that. We have, in a sense, gone the other way around. We have defined what the structure is, and that out of that it will define what is the good life. Out of that, I won't go any further than that, but I think that you can read this slide and go over it again. It's in a sense slightly repetitious of a previous slide, but it drives home the point that there is the social contract is a way of promoting political and social justice as distinct from defining it. It becomes a mechanism of usefulness. But is it free of ethical suppositions and moral suppositions? Well, the moral supposition that it wants to achieve is that morality is a social construct, no society is created. And indeed, this would give credence to that, in fact, would justify that assertion. It also built out an assumption about people, that they're free, equal and rational, that they are people of self-interest. And that's the state of nature that we as people are in. It also takes into account natural science insights to the origin of the state and the origin to the human nature as well. It also is impacted by the view of natural law, particularly in the case of John Locke. And it also leaves a place for rationalism combined with science as an important role. So I would suggest that contractarianism is not free of ethical suppositions. Now, the key contributors to the development of this social compact theory. Well, as far as we're concerned, the big four are Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau and Rawls. Now, the two key players are going to be Hobbes and Locke, and Rousseau is going to add a twist, as is John Rawls. And it's going to be David Gunther, who is a slight modification to John Rawls' views. And Rousseau, Rawls, and Gunther are more concerned about how you make the rules and who makes the rules, whereas Hobbes and Locke are more concerned with the social contract theory and the role of self-interest. So we'll just go through those briefly. You'll see that I'm adding a considerable amount at this point from what's in the textbook. Let's come to Hobbes. I think what's important here with Hobbes is that he has a mechanistic view of human nature. He's a materialist, and his view is that people are necessarily and exclusively self-interested beings. In other words, in your pure state of who you are, all you are is self-interest, self-interest, and self-interest. You have no ulterior aspect to your character at all. And he says, if we were left to be in our primordial state, which is effectively what his state of nature is, we would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish kinds of people, because we'd be just looking after ourselves. We'd be in a state of constant war. It would be a state of brutality, where everyone was afraid you'd lose your life because everyone's free to do what they like. Everyone's rational, but only interested in self-interest. And this terrible state of nature, we just know we have to get out of it. And so people would establish what he calls a social contract, a set of rules to promote social cooperation. And basically what Hobbes says is everyone agrees that someone's got to be in charge. They've got to make the rules, whether they're good rules or bad rules. Someone makes the rules. It's better that someone's in charge with the power of the state, and he opts for the king. He is very much part of the Stuart royal house and its tradition, and he very much wants to assert that this state of the kingdom is far superior to the state of nature, and we will give up our rights, and self-interest is the driving reason behind it. And so membership, and indeed obedience to the society, is imputed to all within the physical realm of the kingdom, on the basis it would just be rational for them to agree to the contract if they've been asked. They would agree. In other words, impute their agreement to them. Now, when we come to John Locke is quite different. Locke's state of nature is quite different. He saw the state of nature as a state of perfect and complete liberty to conduct one's life as one sees it, free from influence of others. We're all equal. We're all rationally capable of discovering and honouring the law of nature, which in Locke's view is the basis of all morality, and that this natural law is given by God. And all the commands of God in natural law concern people's lives, people's health, their liberty, and their possessions. Now, in other words, Locke is looking at society and says society is a place where the state of nature is where we all exist together, whereas Hobbes is saying we are all like this, and it defines what we are, and we have to get out of that state of nature. We'll see that coming up, particularly in the case of Rousseau later on. It's not a condition of individuals, but rather it's the community, made up of families in particular. You'll hear, in a sense, an echo of the ethical views of Aristotle here. Thus, the Commonwealth created when these individuals come together in this state of nature and agree to hand over the power of government. They're saying they'll be willing to be subject to the will of the majority. And at the end, there will be an agreed social contract. And And some people will have agreed to this social contract because it'll be set up constitutionally, but those who are there and weren't putting up their right hand, as it were, will be imputed or implied to have agreed to the terms of this contract. Now, Locke was quite different in the sense that he had a deep concern for the safety of minorities. He, like Hobbes, was a product of this English Civil War and the consequences of the fall of the Stuarts, the rise of the Commonwealth, the fall of the Commonwealth, the rise of the Stuarts again, and then the Glorious Revolution in which the Stuarts are removed and the House of Hanover takes over. It's a period of extraordinary disruption in England. He is very concerned about the rights of the minority. And so he has this safeguard. It is that the majority must protect and respect all the citizens' rights that they have toward their life, their health, their liberty, and their possessions. And he goes for a step further. Now, in addition to a whole discussion about the nature of property, and if you're interested in the ethics of property, it's worth reading John Locke's views. He says, the implied consent that has been imputed to everybody who didn't actually get to raise their hand at the Constitution being declared, that implied consent to the social contract is only valid while these rights are respected by the government. Interesting distinction. Now, what you'll see on the next slide, Hobbes versus Locke, is simply to give you a summary of the two different views. I'm not going to go over them again. I've just gone through these. You can see the summary for yourselves in the PowerPoint notes. What's important to realise is that as far as the tradition following Hobbes, that's picked up by Rawls, and it is becoming more popular today. And because it focuses on justifying the state and what the state does. Whereas Locke's tradition, which is really embedded in our Constitution, which is what you will have basically studied when you study political science, Locke's approach is to see the state as a place that is to establish freedom, to protect people, and to promote people's rights and protect them. In other words, Locke's view isn't focused on producing social justice or reform, whereas Hobbes' view is. So Hobbes' view tends to be driving moral theory today more than Locke's view is. Locke's view is still driving political theory. Though Hobbes' view is talking about the morality of social justice, the morality of social reform, examining the morality of property, and the like. So two quite different traditions. It's probably fair to say that in light of Rawls' work on justice and other things, that quite clearly it's become the popular view. But we can't leave this topic without a quick look at Jacques Rousseau. He began a state of nature and then moved to what he calls his normative state. It's one that he creates an abstract body. In that sense, he's similar to Locke. Locke's state of nature is a state of what is, where the normative state created by Jacques Rousseau is to get over the problems of the state of nature, because it's not possible to get back to the state of nature. The movement of history and the development of natural sciences and what's gone on with property and economics makes it impossible. So, in Rousseau's view, we all have to submit our individual wills to the collective will, acting as free and equal persons, and we do that out of agreements or covenants. What is different about Rousseau is that Rousseau is extremely concerned that we don't have implied consent and we don't have mere historical consent, but rather we have actual consent. And so he tends to have a very direct form of democracy. Perhaps the only place where today we see anything like Rousseau's views is in the Swiss cantons. But nonetheless, it also had a profound influence on Jefferson and others in the creation of the American Constitution. However, in the 20th century, John Rawls developed Hobbes' theory, in a sense, a step forward. And he was particularly focused on who makes the rules. Remember, our definition is that we have these free, equal, and rational people who are determining laws that free, equal, and rational people would agree to. This is a construct. Well, Rawls says, okay, how do you do that? And he claimed that the genuine moral standards are those established only by free, equal, and rational people. So in this sense, he's picking up on the Hobbesian tradition. But he's equally concerned about objectivity. He realized when you give people power, they should be able to make their decisions or their rules somehow in absentia, without distraction. The sort of thing that concerned Plato when he established his philosopher kings and queens. Their only interest was doing justice. Well, Rawls suggests that these, what he calls contractors, who are going to represent us, are going to make the rules from behind a veil of ignorance. It's an imaginary device by which the contractors erase all knowledge of the distinctive traits of the people and circumstances around them in relation to the people who they're making the laws for. In other words, they're making the laws without reference to people or people's self-interest. In other words, they're doing away with political pressure groups and the like, ignoring all such things. On the other hand, what's quite interesting, while Rawls' view is the popular one, Gunther, a Canadian, said that what we really need to have is just recognise that we want people like us making decisions. We want people who've got the same self-interest that we do. That these people who make the rules for us, he calls principals, they do with the least possible concession to others. In other words, they're just like us, but they're not going to get involved with what other people think. What he called his maximum relative concession. Well, we don't know much about Gunther, but the bottom line of this is that that brings us back to our theory. As we do come back to the theory, let's understand that we've got a social contract. Behind it is people agreeing out of their own self-interest to sacrifice their own freedom, to sacrifice their equalities, to sacrifice their ability to reason and make decisions, handing that to free, equal and rational people who make those decisions for them. And it is implied that people will agree to that. Now, perhaps it's worthy to stop and think about the argument for people agreeing to this contract, this imputed agreement. If you assert that the rules that you are making, rules for a constitution, rules for laws, rules for morality, rules for the way society should function, that these rules are being made by free, equal, and rational people, that the rules are rational, and they're the kind of rules that other free, equal, and rational people would agree to. And in such circumstances, it's only rational that you don't have to have people saying, I agree to be bound by those rules. Because if you are an equal, free, and rational person, you are imputed or implied or thought to have, or thought you ought to, agree to those rules. And with that background, we find ourselves having to ask some tough questions about self-interest. Now, it's obvious, if you've compared Locke and Hobbes, that it's obvious that Locke does not consider self-interest to be the primary motivator, or Locke does not consider to be the only motivator. But the Hobbesian tradition tends to be the dominant one today, and behind it is the idea that we are primarily motivated by self-interest. I've already recognised that Hobbes' view comes out of this mechanistic theory of human nature. And Hobbes is even able to argue that adults actually care for young children out of their own self-interest. There's some validity, because I'm sure you may have met people, and perhaps you haven't, but his argument was that in saving and in caring for it, we become the recipients of a strong sense of obligation on the one who's been helped. And so, I'd rather than to die. And so it's in our best interest to help a child live so that they'll look after us. Perhaps your parents, a fit of anger, have said something like, you've cost me $300,000 to raise you to this point. You owe me a lot. You have to pay it back. Well, that's the kind of argument that Hobbes is using here. However, we probably need to respond to that argument by saying that such a child with a sense of gratitude as driving the obligation is motivated by a sense of obligation, not by self-interest. Now, Hobbes, of course, say their parents do it out of self-interest. But the question is, why would the child honour the parent? Well, not out of self-interest. Now, I realise that many children honour their parents very much out of self-interest, that you'll pay their bill and the parents will pay your bills and the like. Well, the bottom line is there's more than one motivating factor here. And further, there are many instances of people sacrificing self and personal gain for reasons other than self-interest. It is really, the rational basis is dubious. There's a fun ethics mind game here in this regard that in a sense applies a statistical analysis to whether or not self-interest is a real motivating factor. It revolves around telling the truth. Both Al and Bob have been found to have stolen and have been caught, and the police are offering them a deal. They can confess and betray their partner, or they can remain silent. Now, of course, as all good criminals who begin the criminal activity agree, if we're caught, none of us will rat the others out. Well, you have before you on the screen a very well-known statistical analysis. Where are they better off? It's fun to look at it for a moment anyway. Take Al's case. He can remain silent. Well, what are the possibilities and what will happen if his partner Bob decides to cooperate and remains silent? In that case, both Bob and Al will get 2 years in prison. So that's what the 2 and 2 stand for, 2 years in prison. That's assuming they both do. But that assumes that Bob and Alan will both keep their word and both remain silent. Well, let's surmise that Al remains silent, but Bill betrays Al. In which case, Al gets 6 years and Bill gets off. Now, if we reverse that, and we have Al confessing, turning his friend in, well, Bob gets 6 years and Al gets nothing. So statistically, the surest bet is that they both betray each other. So statistically, it's in their self-interest, the statisticians would argue, for them both to lie and to break their promise to each other. Well, it's a fun game. It just underlines the difficulty of arguing the profound importance of self-interest as the basis of an argument. But perhaps, quite interestingly, particularly in the light of where we are today in our society, it's important to look at the question of who are the rule makers. Who are these free, equal, and rational people making decisions that free, equal, and rational people would, it is argued, rationally agree, even though there's no formal vote? Hobbes says that's nonsense. let the king do it. Locke says the majority of the elected. Rousseau says let's keep it direct democracy. Rawls suggests there's a select group of people he calls contractors who make the laws from behind a veil of ignorance. And Gunther, as we've recognised, had a small modification to that. What do we make of this? Well, the first is that essentially, except for Rousseau, the rule makers are an elite. However chosen, they become an elite. And they become a small minority leading our country. For example, in our case, we elect representatives. They're not called delegates who go to vote on our behalf the way we've told them to vote. They're representatives who represent a constituency and do so as free, equal and rational people making the best decisions they believe are rational and proper that free, equal and rational people ought to agree with. And if there's any dispute about that, then it can end up before the Supreme Court, where 9 free, equal and rational people will make a decision. So essentially it's government and ethics and morality determined by an elite. And of course the big question is what happens when lawmakers disagree? I've given you the definition again to begin with. And the bottom line, the third bullet point, is the key one. Who arbitrates when these people do not agree? Well, either no decision is made until all agree. You may have been part of an organisation where they've decided that all decisions have to be made unanimously. That is a painstaking arrangement and effectively stops action being taken. Or, as we do in our present democracy, a majority position is taken. Or a smaller and supreme group of free, equal and rational people make the decision. And of course, the connection with our Constitution, again, is very clear. Now, of course, all these theories that we've been talking about, all these different traditions within the social contract theory, I'm not directly talking about the operation of Congress. The parallel is there, and I'm used to try and explain it. But an ethicist is not talking about. He's talking about an abstract idea, a conceptualization. Sometimes some ethicists refer to what those who are seriously interested in ethics and the morality as a science, what such people agree to as being moral is moral, prima facie. And so the idea here is that trying to come up with some abstraction as the basis for morality. And the social contract theory, with all its strengths and all its weaknesses, and we'll talk about those in a moment, that it has become profoundly influential. And in many ways, it is the continuing justification for saying the laws we make on our land are inherently moral, because in a kind of way, they are a reflection of the social contract. And so this social contract theory, in its moral form or political form, interact with each other. And it has a number of, the moral theory, has a number of justifications, a number of things it can be said to justify. And it justifies asserting that morality is a social phenomenon, a social construct. There's not something that fell out of heaven, it's not something that comes from nature, it's not something that is defined by science even. It's something which is fundamentally a social construct. So in other words, arguing against a law on the basis of science is dubious. It's merely a part of an argument. It doesn't carry the day. And for example, you've seen the basis of this social contract is self-interest, and it's dubious, but nonetheless it's a very powerful argument, and that's something to take note of. Your argument may not be overwhelmingly powerful, but it still may be a good argument, and self-interest is a good argument. It justifies the content of moral laws. Those moral laws are justified because free, rational, and equal people have made them. And as a result, those laws are objective. They're not subjective, they're objective in this constructive sort of way. It also justifies the assertion that we have a basic moral duty to obey the laws because we've agreed to the contract. And it's also the basis for punishing people who break the law. So it has a lot of value to it. Liddell points out that it's also a way of justifying breaking moral laws and for civil disobedience, because it is a social construct. All right, we've looked at a number of suggestions or ideas about the benefits or the attractions of contractarianism. Let's look at some of the limitations. And the first one is, do self-interested people want to be moral? Do self-interested people want to be moral? Hobbes has this argument about the fool. He says, the fool is someone who doesn't care about breaking promises. He doesn't care if he's just or unjust. And it does raise an interesting question about self-interest. Is the fundamental reason for acting and behaving justly self-interest at all times? Or can it be that sometimes in a person's best interest, self-interest, to behave unjustly? Or put another way, could it sometimes be rational to behave unjustly? Now, if you think about this for a little bit, you can probably think of justice in a very broad sense. It encompasses at this point doing what is right, doing what is fair, doing what is just, being honest, being truthful. And you know about white lies. And if you are thinking about the legal profession, you learn about legal fictions. Sometimes it's not only rational to not tell the truth, it might be essential. So because there are times when you rationally don't do what's in your self-interest, then it might be rational to break your promises and to behave unjustly. And it doesn't mean you're a fool. So it raises that question. Do people want to be moral? And then self-interest raises another problem. It's another one of these fun academic arguments called the free rider problem. Now, you know about the free rider problem. If you're at college and you in a face-to-face class, you know that you'll be given an assignment. And it'll probably be a group assignment. And the expectation of the instructor is that you will, say 3 or 4 people, work together to produce a paper, and you'll submit the paper. And you'll all theoretically sit around, you agree that the student will do this, and the student will do that, and they'll do this, and you'll do this, and we'll come together and piece the paper together. And someone will read it through and make it a cohesive whole. Well, you all know the free rider comes in. Almost always, someone in that group doesn't pull their weight. They don't do what they need to do for the good of the whole. And so everybody else has to pick up the slack because everyone wants a grade. So this person gets their A or B grade for the essay or paper presented, even though they didn't do the work. They were a free rider. Now, in other words, the free rider is a person who breaks the rules. He breaks the law. And the Tao says it is rational to become a just person. And it's always rational for just people to behave justly. This is a bit like Plato's argument that it's good to be good. He also suggests that the converse is true, that it's never rational to behave unjustly in a well-ordered society, especially where transgressions of society's rules is punishable. And this is a classic thing with the criminal who breaks the law and is of the view that he won't get caught. Well, rationally, majority do get caught. In other words, if you have a social contract, you're going to have free riders. If you have a social contract, you're going to have some fools. Well, how do we justify all these agreements? First, we recognise that all the theories recognise, other than Rousseau's, agree there's a historical or actual agreement and there's the implied or tacit agreement, and how you view that is different in many of the cases. But the bottom line is everybody's in the pool. Everybody's in. Whether you put your hand up and said yes, or whether it's imputed or implied to you. Now, the argument for actual consent, which is sort of Rousseau type of argument, is we only have a duty to obey laws if we've consented to do so. And many people haven't given their consent to obey the law. Therefore, many people don't have a duty to obey the law. Well, that's a pretty good argument. However, the justification for insisting on implied consent revolves around this concept of free, equal and rational people establishing rules that free, rational, equal people would agree to if they were exercising rationality. If that rule is established on that basis, then it's morally right for people to obey that rule, and for people to be held responsible for that moral duty, so that the absence of any actual agreement doesn't release us from our moral duties. And we see that in our own view of jurisprudence today, that ignorance is no excuse for not knowing the law. So when the policeman pulls you over and he says you were doing 50 in the 35 mile an hour limit, and you say, I didn't see the sign, ignorance is no excuse. Well, what do you need to know about contractarianism? I want you to be aware of the background facts impacting this whole social contract tradition. Do be aware of the definitions as we've given them in this lecture. Be aware of the role of contractarianism in promoting political and social justice. And in particular, I want you to know about Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau and Rawls. They're the four key ones here. And be aware of Locke's views and the impact of his views on the nation's social contract. There are issues you need to be aware of. To what extent is contractarianism free of moral and ethical suppositions? How you can justify self-interest as a moral motivator. Know something of the prisoner's dilemma. There's something of the discussion of the rule makers and what happens when rule makers disagree. Be able to articulate some of the benefits and attractions of contractarianism, and be able to address the major concerns and limitations I've listed there for you. Thank you for your involvement and watching the video, and I wish you all the best.